The Vietnam War and its context. World War II didn't just reshape borders, it reshaped the entire balance of global power. While the Allies fought together to defeat Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, a deeper tension was already brewing between two of the victors, the United States and the Soviet Union. A multinational disagreement on how to run the freshly anti-Nazi world led to wars, devastation, and unimaginable loss. At first, the US and the Soviet Union were uneasy allies, but once Hitler was defeated, their differences became impossible to ignore. The US stood for capitalism and democracy. The Soviet Union promoted communism and authoritarian control. Each wanted to shape the post-war world in its own image. After the war, Europe was divided. The Soviets dominated Eastern Europe, setting up communist governments. The US backed Western Europe with aid and military alliances. The division of Germany, especially Berlin, became the symbolic front line of the Cold War. The Cold War was born from the ashes of World War II. With nuclear weapons in play and mutual distrust growing, the world stepped into a new era, one of espionage, propaganda, and the constant threat of global conflict. World War II ended in 1945, with the Cold War beginning almost immediately, not with bullets, but with ideologies, suspicions, and a race for global influence that would last nearly half a century. It didn't bring global peace. Instead, a global power struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. Though they had been allies against the Nazi Germanies, the two nations had very different goals. The US promoted democracy and capitalism, while the Soviets promoted communism and authoritarian control. As Europe was divided between East and West, the US and the USSR began a decades-long rivalry, fighting for influence around the world without directly going to war with one another.
The Cold War was not fought on a single battlefield. Rather than the Soviets and the US directly fighting each other, they fought in proxy wars in other countries where they supported opposite sides. The Vietnam War was the most devastating example of proxy wars. The USSR and the US did not just send money and weapons. The Vietnam War wasn't just a fight between North and South, but it was a clash between different ideologies. The North was fighting for communism, backed by the Soviet Union, and the South was heavily supported by the United States. The U.S. committed thousands of troops to Vietnam. The cost of the Vietnam War was very high. More than 58,000 American soldiers were killed, and millions of Vietnam civilians and fighters were killed. Entire villages were destroyed and forests burned by napalm and Agent Orange. The Vietnam War was not just a national tragedy, but part of the global conflict that was the Cold War. These proxy wars rarely were just about one country's fate. They were about influence, power, and global dominance. The people who suffered the most often had the least control over what was happening. For example, in the Vietnam War, civilians were often caught between the two superpowers who were just using their country as a stage for their warfare. The Vietnam War showed the world just how destructive these proxy wars could be. It was not just a military defeat for the U.S., but showed how high the cost of human lives were in fighting these wars. The destruction left so much devastation in Vietnam and in the Cold War's history.
The Vietnam War consisted of many different types of war methods. The first one is conventional war methods, like the search and destroy missions done by infantry by both forces. These operations were aimed at locating enemy forces, engaging them in combat, and then withdrawing immediately after the confrontation rather than holding the territory. Another form of conventional wars was the air support. The U.S. focused heavily on air support, using bombing campaigns and airstrikes to disrupt enemy supply lines and support ground troops. Operations like Rolling Thunder and widespread use of aircraft reflected the strategy centered on technological and aerial dominance. There was also a lot of river warfare done with small boats in the Mekong Delta. River warfare in the Mekong Delta involved U.S. and South Vietnamese forces using heavily armed patrol boats to navigate narrow waterways, disrupt Viet Cong supply routes, and engage in swift close quarters combat. The most popular form of war was Agent Orange. Agent Orange was a toxic herbicide used by the U.S. during the Vietnam War to destroy forest cover, crops, which later caused severe health issues and environmental damage to the Vietnamese. Agent Orange caused serious health problems to those exposed, including cancer, birth defects, and other long-term illnesses, affecting both Vietnamese civilians and U.S. veterans. Agent Orange caused a widespread deforestation, soil degradation, and contamination of water sources, leading to long-lasting environmental damage in affected areas of Vietnam. Another form of war was the Viet Cong tunnels. The Viet Cong tunnels were an extensive underground network used for hiding, communication, storage, surprise attacks, allowing guerrilla fighters to evade U.S. forces and sustain operations throughout the Vietnam War. The U.S. used tunnel rats, and they were specially trained soldiers who entered Viet Cong tunnel systems to search for enemy fighters, gather intelligence, destroy tunnels, and clear booby traps, often working in dark, cramped, and dangerous conditions.
The anti-war movement within America began very slowly at first, but quickly grew to massive proportions, with its protests still serving as a reminder to the U.S. government how unpopular the draft truly is. Many groups that led the charge were originally groups for other types of global change, such as groups for nuclear disarmament or groups for racial justice, such as the Black Panthers. Many protests were in forms of media. One such media was songs. Certain songs like Fortunate Son critiqued the aspects of the draft, with lyrics such as I Ain't No Senator's Son, which critiqued how people in power were able to avoid the draft whilst the average person could not. Other music was also used as anti-war material, whether initially written for Vietnam or not. Paint It Black was a song that was resonated with many due to the lyrics that depict grief and sorrow in oneself. Protests reached a peak at Kent State, May 4th, 1970, where 4 students were shot and killed by the National Guard in an anti-war protest. These deaths came after a series of protests caused by Richard Nixon's authorization of a preemptive strike for soldiers to cross over from South Vietnam into Cambodia. These shootings sparked a major outrage and were a pivotal point towards the ending of the Vietnam War.
When most people think of the Vietnam War, they probably picture soldiers in jungles, huge protests back in the States, and those intense helicopter scenes. But there's a whole other side to the story, one that happened behind closed doors in secret meetings and government memos. The U.S. Office of Historian provides a guide to the records from the Nixon and Ford years, including files from the CIA, military leaders, and key figures like Henry Kissinger. These documents reveal the struggles the U.S. faced behind the scenes and its ties to the end of the war. One revealing memo, written by Kissinger in 1969, warns President Nixon the public support for the war was fading pretty fast. He doubted that the South Vietnamese government would survive without the U.S. troops and feared the withdrawal would lead to collapse. This shows even top U.S. advisors weren't sure how to win or even leave the situation. At the same time, the CIA and the U.S. government are running covert operations. In a declassified report by Thomas Ahern, it shows that agents were supporting local armies, influencing elections, and gathering intelligence. But despite these efforts, the CIA often misunderstood the Vietnamese politics system and understood how it was ran, and struggled to work and effectively work with the U.S. and South Vietnamese embassies at the time. Even after the fighting stopped, peace didn't come quickly. Historian Amand Demir explains that full diplomacy relationships between the U.S. and Vietnam government weren't restored until the 1990s. Cold War politics, missed American soldiers, and deep mistrust all slow down the process of making amends between these two governments.